This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Princeton University Press, which has loads of great titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is The Last Human Job by Allison Pugh. With the development of AI and labor-saving tech like self-checkouts and automated factories, the future of work has never been more uncertain. The new book, The Last Human Job by Allison Pugh, explores the human connections that underlie our work and argues that it's worth preserving. Drawing on in-depth interviews and observations with a range of professionals, from physicians, teachers, and coaches to chaplains, therapists, and hairdressers, Pugh develops the concept of connective labor, work that relies on empathy, spontaneity, and a mutual recognition of each other's humanity. Beyond threats posed by AI or apps, Pugh shows how profit-driven campaigns introduce standardized practices that hinder our ability to truly see each other. She concludes with profiles of organizations where connective labor thrives, offering practical steps for building a social architecture that works. Learn more about The Last Human Job by Allison Pugh at princeton.press/job. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the 13th episode of Thawra, The Dig's rolling series on 20th century Arab politics with historian Abdel Razzaq Takriti. Thawra is Arabic for revolution. It's a word that contains historical multitudes, diverse political radicalisms and revolts that have swept across Arab lands over the past century. We are getting very, very close to the end of this series. The 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq overthrew Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime. George W. Bush promised that this blow against tyranny had loosed democratic energies that would spread like a tidal wave, inaugurating a new era for the entire region. He pledged, quote, "Iraqi democracy will succeed, and that success will send forth the news from Damascus to Tehran that freedom can be the future of every nation. The establishment of a free Iraq at the heart of the Middle East will be a watershed event in the global democratic revolution." Bush, of course, was very wrong about Iraq. The invasion brought far, far more death than it did freedom. But the very premise also had everything entirely upside down. Damascus was launched on its tragic path of constant coups, leading to authoritarian dictatorship by the CIA operation that brought Hosni al-Zaim to power in 1949. The Shah wielded dictatorial power in Tehran and laid the groundwork for the Islamic Revolution thanks to a CIA and British intelligence orchestrated coup against Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. Iraq's stark departure from its early revolutionary socialist promise to repressive statism would also be unthinkable without the role of Western imperialist powers in promoting anti-communism, Kurdish-Arab internal strife, and the Iran-Iraq War. The West sees the Middle East as a land of violent sectarianism, Islamic fundamentalism, and brutal dictatorship. What's at work is projection. The West views the Middle East as the opposite of a Western liberal order that holds out a universal promise, a liberatory promise that, perversely, can only be realized through more fully securing Western domination. What's perverse here, to be clear, is that the West views the wreckage of its own imperialist designs as the natural state of Middle Eastern politics and social relations, thus legitimating further imperialist violence. Let's begin again at the beginning. The Western contribution to authoritarian government in the Middle East was initiated by the British, who made it a point to set up monarchical power in Iraq and Jordan and to secure its expansion in Saudi Arabia. It was a strategy that aimed at disarticulating a multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire with a governing formula amenable to London's own imperial project. And Nowhere was this proclivity for royal rule more obvious than the Arabian Peninsula, where, as we discussed in the last episode, the British not only facilitated the House of Saud's conquest of the Hejaz, but also set up the crucial state sheikdoms that in 1971 became the United Arab Emirates. Royal rule was likewise secured by the British Empire in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar. So these powerful 21st century Gulf states, capitals emirates in the words of Colin Powers, were forged not by divine fiat or customary force, but by a capitalist colonial power in the North Atlantic. But what about the rest of the Gulf? We hear less frequently about southern Arabia, namely Oman and Yemen, though these were profoundly consequential pillars of British power in the Arabian Peninsula, and so also across the region as a whole. Revolutionary struggles that challenged colonial and monarchical power in these two countries are the subject of today's episode. Muscat, today the capital of Oman, became the first Arab foothold of British imperial power in 1798. The empire's first sphere of influence in a region it would over the next century and a half come to thoroughly dominate. South Yemen's hinterlands became British protectorates surrounding the Aden colony, a key node in the British Empire that facilitated maritime power and profit through the Red Sea and Suez and across the Arabian Sea to British India. These Arab protectorates were governed by so-called traditional rulers who, in fact, were creatures of colonial power, a form of modern indirect rule dressed up in the garb of timeless parochial orthodoxy. In Muscat, the British over the 19th century made the ruling Al Said family into a sultanate. The sultans of Muscat had ambitions of their own, which intersected with British interests too. They annexed Dhofar, the southernmost region of what today is Oman. They then, in the mid-20th century, conquered land belonging to the Abadi Imamate, seeking to secure newly discovered oil on behalf of the Western Oil Company-owned Petroleum Development Oman, PDO. But resistance ensued. First, the Abadi Imamate, a relatively loose and horizontalist form of religious and tribal governance, rebelled against the Sultan's expansion. Then, in 1965, Dhofaris aligned with the movement of Arab nationalists launched a major Then, in 1965, Dhofaris aligned with the movement of Arab nationalists. Then, in 1965, Dhofaris, aligned with the movement of Arab nationalists, launched a major armed struggle through what was initially called the Dhofar Liberation Front. At the same time, another group in the movement of Arab nationalist family tree, the National Liberation Front, was waging a revolutionary struggle in South Yemen, seizing power amid the British withdrawal in 1967 and creating the Marxist People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. Recall that the movement of Arab nationalists was formed in Beirut as the Arab Nationalist Youth in 1951. It was in significant part led by Palestinians from the beginning and then built a substantial presence across the Arab East, becoming a truly powerful force in Kuwait and the leading Nasserist organization throughout the Middle East. In the 1960s, however, the movement of Arab nationalists was radicalizing, embracing a third world Marxist national liberation politics that exceeded and at some stages clashed with Nasserism, leading not only to South Yemen's NLF and the Dhofar Liberation Front, but also, as we'll discuss in the series' final episodes, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the major left-wing factions of the Palestinian national liberation struggle. The Arabian Peninsula, however, was the only place where a group that emerged from the movement of Arab nationalists gained state power, part of a strategy of armed struggle that they hoped would knock down all of the region's imperialist-aligned monarchs. In Oman, however, they were unsuccessful. The Dhofaris waged a struggle against a brutal sultanate, By the 1960s, the only place on earth where chattel slavery was still legal at the time. The majority of enslaved people owned by the Sultan himself. The Dhufari insurgency was defeated thanks to the decisive military power of the British Empire, and also of British imperial allies like the Shah of Iran, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. Also critical to the Sultanate's victory was a British coup against the Sultan in 1970. Faced with a ruler who refused the reforms necessary to defeat the revolution, the British, who had created and sustained the political authority of Sultan Saeed bin Tamur, toppled him, installing his son, Qaboos bin Saeed, who proceeded, with British support, to build an absolutist state like nothing Oman had ever witnessed. So much for democracy promotion. This is the history of imperialist state building in the Middle East. In short, the religiously conservative and authoritarian monarchies of the Arabian Peninsula are modern inventions in substantial part of Western imperialist power. This episode is the story of the revolutionary armed movements that sought to remake Arabia and the entire Arab world toward different decolonial ends. Before we get started, 2 requests. First, please support The Dig and our Thawra series at patreon.com/thedig. The Dig, and particularly Thawra, these are political education projects that we provide free to everyone with no paywall, only because listeners like you contribute what you can. We also send all contributors our excellent newsletters. Others, depending on how much you contribute and where you live, get books, tote bags, coffee mugs sent in the mail. These thank you gifts are great, don't get me wrong, but the real reason you should contribute, if you can afford to, is because that's what makes The Dig possible and what makes this series happen. That's patreon.com/thedig. There's a link in the show notes. Please take a moment and click it now. Secondly, please spread the word about Thawra. Tell a friend, tell some strangers, in real life, on the internet. Please make propaganda for us. Okay, here's Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University. A scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements, he's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website, an incredible resource that'll be back online soon. Both of the South Arabian revolutionary organizations that we're discussing this episode, in Oman and in South Yemen, they both emerged from the movement of Arab nationalists. So we should start this episode by assessing where the movement was by the mid-1960s, particularly in terms of some really important splits that began to emerge over the organization's relationship to Nasser and to socialism. There were figures like Muhsin Ibrahim and Naif Hawatma confronting old guard leaders like George Habash. And at this point, my understanding is they were demanding that the movement become more socialist and also fully dissolve itself into Nasserism. Interestingly, this left-wing faction of the movement's position on Nasserism would entirely flip after 1967. But these are important dividing lines that do endure and are very consequential over the long haul. Lay out where the movement of Arab nationalists is in the early 1960s and what these splits or divisions, factions, reflected about the ideological and organizational distance that the organization had traveled since its founding as the Arab Nationalist Youth in 1951.
Yeah, so the movement of Arab nationalists, as we mentioned in previous episodes, in the 1950s, started with an attraction to classical ideas of nationalism and to notions of the nation and the national struggle preceding and even superseding any other form of struggle, including the class struggle. So they were advocating a theory that was conceptualized by their main ideologue in the 1950s, Al-Hakam Darwaza, who basically said that there has to be two stages in any nation's movement for liberation. The first one entails the expulsion of the colonialists, and in the case of the Arab national case, the unification of the Arab countries. And then the second stage will entail the element of social struggle. Here, this became a very controversial position within the movement as a new generation of movement of Arab nationalist youth were entering into the scene in the 1950s.
Because the original position made them functionally anti-communist.
The original position made them anti-communist, and indeed, there were even important texts written by the movement of Arab nationalists that were denunciations of communists. There was a text called Local Communism, and basically it was accusing communists of being agents of imperialism and colonialism. And remember, the movement of Arab nationalists at this stage was still very much centered on the Nakba and on reversing the Nakba. So it really had a grudge against the communists because of the position regarding the partition resolution. New generations of movement of Arab nationalist youth had changed their view as the 1950s progressed. Partly, as part of a broader process. As we've seen in previous episodes, communists were becoming more adaptable to ideas of pan-Arabism and ideas of even Arab nationalist self-determination within certain parameters. In the case of the nationalists, they were increasingly gravitating towards a more communist position. I think that one element that was taking place now was that you had the growth of a general third worldist orientation in which Marxism was playing a major role. And that is definitely a factor that contributed to the general ideational shift that was taking place within the movement of Arab nationalists. Younger people were starting to encounter Marxist writings. They were starting to encounter Marxist forms of organizing. They were beginning to experiment with these ideas after the foundation of the movement of Arab nationalists' main mouthpiece. In 1960, it founds Al-Hurriya, which continues to be published to this day. Liberty or Freedom, Al-Hurriya, was published in Beirut. And the editor was Mohsen Ibrahim, who was from the second generation of movement of Arab nationalist leaders. He was a high school teacher. He came to the movement from that background, Lebanese from the south, who very much departed in some of his ideas from the original positions of the movement. Naif Hawatmeh was another second generation leader. And again, when we speak of second generation, we should note it's not that big of an age difference between them and the founding fathers, but a few years makes a big difference in moments like that, when there's so much regional change taking place. And in the case of Naif Hawatmeh, he comes from Jordan, a Jordanian Christian family from the city of Salt. He grew up in a relatively rural environment that affected him. He had a sense of class as well. These were folks that were beginning to present certain ideas through Al-Hurriya, and they were pushing for a more radical orientation.
It was during this period, in 1964, the same year that the PLO was founded, it was then that the movement of Arab nationalists founded its first ever Palestinian branch, the National Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And we'll be ending this series with a lengthy discussion of the Palestinian Revolution that exploded after 1967. And two key organizations of the Palestinian Revolution come out of the movement of Arab nationalists, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. But before we get there in future episodes, what accounts for the movement's new emphasis in the mid-1960s, before the 67 war, on Palestinian liberation as a particular struggle? A reminder to listeners that even though the movement was founded in substantial part by Palestinians like Habash, their emphasis had long been on liberating Palestine through Arab nationalist unity, really the inverse of what became Fatah's position.
Right. So the position of the movement of Arab nationalists was that you need to unify the Arab countries and liberate them. So first you liberate the countries from colonialism, then you unify them, and then through doing that, you create a very strong economic and political base, as well as a military reconstruction program that would then allow for carrying out liberation of Palestine from the surrounding Arab countries. So it was very much a liberation vision in which Arab armies played a big role, and a future Arab army from a unified Arab state plays a big role. I know this is a difficult vision for people to understand in the West, because they're used to celebrating Israeli military and they're used to thinking of self-defense as an Israeli concept. For Arabs, this was a concept of self-defense because they were seeing it as a return of usurped lands. And basically, they thought of the armies of that period as playing a key role, given the fact that it was through military force that all of these countries were colonized in the first place, but also that a settler colonial state like the Israeli state was founded. So this was, the overall vision at the time. Now, there were certain circumstances that were influencing this vision also. And this connects to your previous question, Daniel, because one element I forgot to mention in the previous question was that the movement was increasingly tied to Nasserism. And even its shift towards socialism was partly occasioned by Nasser's strong shift to socialism,
which Nasser started to turn more aggressively towards in the wake of Syria's secession from the UAR.
Correct. So that becomes a very crucial dimension. In that context where you're so tied to Nasserism, your concept of liberation is also tied to that. Now, they had a contradiction that they were facing at this stage. So the contradiction that they were facing at this stage was that on the one hand, they were presenting themselves as a very radical movement on the grassroots level, as a movement representing what they viewed as the vanguard of the Arab youth, as the most disciplined, the most virtuous. They had a big emphasis, by the way, on these classical 19th century ideas like virtue, okay? They considered themselves to be the ones that were promoting a most steadfast and principled line. However, at the same time, they were tying themselves with the policy of a state, in this case, Egypt. And that state at this stage did not want a clash with the Israeli settler colonial state. And, it did not want that clash because Nasser, unlike these radical movements, was a head of a state. And he understood very well what the military capacity of his state was. And he knew very well that his army was not ready for a clash. He did not have the weaponry necessary. He did not have the supplies. And he was confronting a state that was backed by geopolitical forces that included the most powerful empires of the day and the major superpower being the United States. So this was a situation where the movement had to cater to its grassroots and had to explain why it was not carrying out an immediate liberation of Palestine program. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this is that there was also pressure on the movement and on the grassroots in the movement due to the formation of groups like Fatah, who were spreading material saying we need an immediate national liberation struggle to be launched right now. We need a revolutionary struggle. We need something akin to the Algerian Revolution. And that means that the Palestinian people have to play the lead role in that. And we cannot wait for the Arab countries to be liberated and unified and to remove the reactionary rulers for us to start this process. Their motto, unlike that of the movement of Arab nationalists, was the liberation of Palestine is the pathway to Arab unity. So it's the reverse, which is the opposite, of course, of the movement of Arab nationalist position, which is Arab unity will facilitate the liberation of Palestine.
Let's turn to the armed struggle in Oman, waged by the Dhofar Liberation Front, which again grew out of the movement of Arab nationalism, and we'll get into that all in a minute. But first we should pause to explain Oman and the situation of the Dhofaris. How was the Sultanate of Muscat and Oman, as it came to exist by the 1950s and 60s, how was it territorially and politically consolidated in the way that it was through, first, the establishment of British power in the region beginning at the end of the 18th century, then second, in the late 19th century through the conquest of Dhofar on the southeastern end of the Arabian Peninsula, and then third, in the mid-20th century through the conquest of the Omani interior, territory that had not been governed by the Sultan, but had been part of the Imamate of Oman. Listeners might recall from, I think, our first episode that Oman, in fact, has the oldest history of European colonialism in the Arab world by far, I think. The Portuguese conquered Muscat in the early 16th century. The British signed their first colonial treaty ever with Muscat's ruler in 1798 to protect the region from French expansion. This is the era of French Revolutionary Wars. This is how far back this goes. And then throughout the early 19th century, Muscat backed the British in attacks on Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah, today parts of the UAE, over what they pejoratively condemned as piracy. But there's a lot here, but lay this out. How did the colonial power of the British Raj first build the Sultanate in Muscat and then out across Oman's coast and then southward and finally westward, territorially and politically consolidating what by the 1950s and 60s, the Sultanate of Muscat and Oman?
The main dynamic that was occurring in Oman for much of its history was a dynamic between the interior and the coast, and a dynamic between basically the temporal rulers and the kind of more rulers connected to religious legitimacy. Now, the dynamic was complicated because the majority of the people of Oman in northern Oman belong to the Ibadi sect of Islam. And that's part of the Kharijite tradition in Islam. Of course, today the Omani state tries to deny that connection. They try to assert their closeness to Sunnism. But the Kharijite sect of Islam, and the Ibadi version of it, which is a more moderate version of Kharijism, emphasizes, for listeners who don't know about this, the idea that a ruler has to be elected and they can be deposed, which is unlike the notions of rule after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in Sunni Islam, which asserted basically that the ruler has to come from the broader tribe to which the Prophet belonged, Quraysh, and the Shia version, which even had a narrower base for who a ruler could come from. Their view was that it should be the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad through the line of his daughter Fatima and her husband Ali, his cousin. So this outlook, you had degrees. One vision was very aristocratic. A second vision was loosely aristocratic. And then the Kharijite one was actually anti-aristocratic. But it was also anti-statist. So within the Omani tradition, and certainly within the Ibadi tradition as a whole, there is this opposition to the idea of the Imam, the ruler of the believers, as a figure that has more control than they need to defend the community. So they have limits on how much the Imam could raise in terms of taxes, and they have limits on the notion of his ability to have a standing army. So the Imam should not have a standing army, and they should not be able to raise beyond the bare minimum of taxes required. And this was a way of ensuring that no individual figure has centralizing power. So it's an anti-statist ideology at its essence. Because any state, of course, and we know this from the history of state formation, requires armies and a treasury to be able to expand and function and dominate any space. So the Ibadi method of politics, of conducting politics, was very much designed to create polycentric centers of political authority. It was designed to create a situation where the political center was always weak, but there were multiple centers of power, and mostly those centers of power belonged to two sets of people. One was tribal leaders, and the other was religious leaders. Now, there is a trend in Omani history, though, of imams getting elected and then going down the centralizing route, and they do that by leaving essentially the interior, which is the heartland of Ibadism, essentially going to Muscat, which is this major port that has important Indian Ocean trade connections and important Gulf trade connections at the same time. Oman is incredibly strategic. It's a connecting point between those two spots, between the Indian Ocean and the Gulf. This kind of location meant that you always had an important trading function in that country, and that's played through the coastal cities like Muscat, like Sur, like various other important ports in the history of Oman. So the British come in. They come in at a time when the latest manifestation of an imamate turning into an earthly form of rule took place. And that's under the Al Busaid. The Oman had undergone a civil war in the 18th century. And out of that civil war, you had the rise of a new clan. That clan expelled a foreign invasion, in this case coming from Iran, but in the process of expelling that foreign invasion on the part of this imam, that led this process and that was elected to expel the foreign invasion, that imam his sons end up inheriting his power, which is a faux pas in the Badi tradition, but it has precedence. So that's how the Al Busaid ruling dynasty comes into power in Oman. Now, they come into power, they control, of course, the main trading hubs in the coast, and they develop a large-scale empire, an Indian Ocean one, that functions across this space. It has important colonies, and they really follow in the footsteps of the Portuguese that they had expelled from Oman. It's a strange situation where you have this possibly the earliest anti-colonial success, possibly anywhere. I don't know if any success as big as that. They really give the Portuguese a hard time and just followed them everywhere. But then they acquired the territories that the Portuguese had ruled. So, you found that the Omanis had control over the large parts of the East African coast. That's why if you look at the languages in East Africa, Swahili has a lot of Arabic in it, has a lot of Arabic in it. That's out of this process. And of course, it's partly trade, but partly also military control and outposts. And then you had them in establishing power in Zanzibar. They established power in Gaudur.
Part of modern-day Tanzania.
Yes. And of course, until Zanzibar had its own revolution in the early 60s, it was ruled by Al Busaid, the Busaidi ruler, Sultan. So it was related, of course, it was a cousin of the Sultan of Muscat. So we have this complicated situation where the British come in and they find these local strong powers, like the rulers of Muscat, the Sayyids of Muscat at the time, that's how they were referred to, and like also equivalents to them on the Indian side of the Indian Ocean. In particular, Muscat had a very close relationship with Tipu Sultan, who was ruling in the South India, of course, and the British celebrated destroying his power and made a big deal around it. I mean, to this day, they plundered the wealth of his palace and they took it to London, and a lot of this stolen stuff in London comes from that. But that was not only, the function of that was not only to dominate India, it was to teach a lesson to other regional, smaller empires like Oman. It was to send a signal to the Sayyid of Muscat that, look, this is the only power in this region. You're not allowed to flirt with any other imperial power or develop any relationship with them, including in this case the French, of course, in the context of the competition with Napoleon. But also, you'd better cooperate with us through signing agreements. And that's the context of the 1798 agreement. Now, the Sayyids of Muscat initially find this to be very advantageous because they thought this is a way for them to enhance their power in relation to other local rulers that they were competing with in their own neighborhood. So the biggest competition for Muscat at the time was coming from Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah, which were ruled by this alliance of essentially trading alliance, the Qasimites. And the problem with this trading alliance from a British perspective was that it was competing with the East India Company. So they wanted to take it out. And their ideology for doing that was the equivalent to the war on terror today. They called it a war on piracy. And they developed a partnership with the Sayyid of Muscat, being like, how about we come together and we go and do expeditions against these people and destroy their ships and destroy their fleets and bomb the hell out of them. So this becomes a very strong partnership initially. Of course, partnership is the wrong word because there is a much stronger empire dealing with a local power using its local know-how and geographic expertise, but also knowledge about its competitors regionally to go and effectively destroy them. And this is the origins of the relationship between the Al Busaidi sultans, who will later become the sultans of initially they were called the Sayyids, and the British. As a result of this relationship, increasingly Oman falls into the British orbit, and eventually it effectively loses its independence.
That's a lot of history that goes further back than anything else we've discussed in this series. Let's move forward to the late 19th century and the Sultan in Muscat's conquest of Dhofar, events that are entangled with both British colonial rule in India and tribal divisions in Dhofar.
In the case of Dhofar, it had its own history that was kind of separate from the developments that I was referring to earlier. Dhofar is geographically distinct from the rest of Oman. And indeed, it's a very special place in the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula because Dhofar gets a heavy dose of the monsoon. And the Indian Ocean monsoon really produces this incredible large green oasis. In British writings, they often compare it to the size of Wales. You have the highlands there. You have
a cloud forest.
Essentially, there's a cloud forest in the highlands. Yeah, and it's incredible. I've seen it. So there's this whole dynamic between coast and mountain and Dhofar. It has its own economic base. For a long time, it depended on the frankincense trade. There's all these biblical references to it based on that. There's all these ancient references to it. That's what Dhofar is associated with. By the way, on a random tangent, for Mormons, and our American listeners will appreciate this, it has a religious significance for Mormons because in the Book of Mormon, there's a ship that sails from Dhofar. So now there's American pilgrims that go there from Utah, especially. That's a trend that I think people would be interested in. Anyways, to go back to our main thing. So Dhofar had its own history. It was actually much closer to what is now the southern part of Yemen in many ways, in terms of its political dynamics and in terms of its social makeup and its topography and so on. But occasionally there was some influence on the part of the Sayyids of Muscat there, and eventually they take it over, and that happens in the context of late 19th century dynamics, where you have a moment in which there is competition between the British and their Ottoman allies over the Gulf. The Ottomans want to make sure that they don't lose their claims to different parts of the Gulf. They were worried. They had this moment when they were trying to reassert their power regionally. And of course, this did not accord well with Britain. Britain was their main sponsor, of course, when it came to the defense of the Ottoman Empire against Russia. But that did not mean that they did not have some disagreements in other areas. And the main person that was following or trying to basically raise the Ottoman flag there was this incredible figure from India who was one of these Hadrami mystics, Sufi leader, from the Malabar coast, who had played a big role in something that our listeners who are familiar with Indian history would know, the so-called Mapila uprisings of the 19th century. These were led by these Sufi sheikhs, essentially, that had enormous influence amongst the peasantry, especially the Muslim peasantry in the southern part of the Indian subcontinent. And they, as a result, like some of them, including this ruler that came to Dhofar, Fadl bin Alawi, they ended up being wanted by the British. They were chased around. So Fadl bin Alawi tries to make a bid for ruling Dhofar after he's expelled from India and after he's on the run from the British. His uprising obviously fails, and he ends up in Mecca, meets some Dhofari pilgrims. They get very impressed by him. They think he has enormous religious knowledge, and he has this reputation as somebody who was pious but also stood up to the British and so on. And they invite him to basically come and rule in Dhofar. Now, the one feature of Dhofari society was that it was not a place that was, again, amenable to central government. And I know that often in our ways of thinking about human history, we're taught or we're encouraged to think that central government was always the norm and that the state was always the norm. But actually, in large swaths of this earth, that was not the case. There were often tribal arrangements, there were other arrangements. And by the way, tribal arrangements are not necessarily worse. Sometimes, again, we have this state-centric view that views them as worse, but that's not necessarily the case. Actually, from a democratic perspective, they could offer more space for participation of people in decision making. I'm not glorifying the tribe, by the way. There is a trend that does that romanticizes it, but I'm just noting that it plays a political function, and in the case of Dhofar, it certainly did. Now, the problem, though, with tribal forms of organization is that you end up with kinship clashes. And that was an important aspect of what was going on in Dhofar before the invitation of Fadl bin Alawi to the terrain. So there were two big tribal confederations operating there. There was the Qarra, there was the Al-Kathir, and that led to a competition over power between these clans.
And one of them went to the Sultanate to strengthen their own hand in the conflict.
Yes, after they both rebel against Fadl, because the minute he shows up, he wants to do the model he knows, which is the state model, and he wants to create a state in Dhofar, and he wants to make it more efficient. He wants to put it on the map. He wants revenues, and he wants an army. So, of course, that means taxation, which is the main virtue of the anti-statist model, is that there's no taxes. So he comes in and starts essentially trying to impose this tax and ends up with a rebellion that drives him out. Now, the British come and find this to be an opportunity for them to stabilize this part of the Indian Ocean, which is close to India, that had come under the influence of a figure that they did not approve of. And they wanted to make sure that this does not happen again. They don't want somebody who had rebelled against their empire to come and rule a space that's so close to their main imperial holding. So they end up encouraging or facilitating a claim that was made by the Sultan of Muscat at this stage. By then they become sultans. Under British tutelage, the Sayyids of Muscat become sultans of Muscat. They make a bid, and the Sultan essentially is given the green light by the British to come and take over Dhofar. Now, that was at the invitation of one of the tribal blocks, but they ended up regretting it later on and rebelling against him. But that rebellion did not go too far because, again, once you're under the rule of a ruler like that, the empire that's backing them will continue to help them stabilize any forms of major rebellion against their domains, because they see them as an instrument towards achieving what I called in my book imperial sovereignty. And in this case, imperial sovereignty is enacted through investing power in a local figure of the empire's choosing and enabling that figure to dominate local space on behalf of the empire.
Following the late 19th century annexation of Dhofar, we then have the mid-20th century conquest of the Imamates territory, which was undertaken in significant part for the purposes of securing oil. And the concession for that oil had already been awarded in advance to the Western consortium-owned Iraq Petroleum Company. And the conquest then sparked a major war, the Imamates al-Jabal al-Aqda rebellion. How did the war with the Imamate, this rebellion, erupt? And then how did it play out? What role did the British and Arab regional powers play? And lastly, what was the significance of the Imamate's defeat?
Again, like to understand this, we have to go back to the division that we spoke about earlier between the coast and the interior in Oman. And that division became more pronounced as the local rulers in Muscat became more absorbed into the British network. As they got absorbed into that network, they became weaker and weaker because whatever wealth they had depended on the colonies that they had outside of Muscat. And essentially, after the death of the main Sayyid of Muscat that had cooperated with the British the most, his name was Said al-Kabir, Said the Great, his sons end up battling over whatever colonial possessions they had. So one of the sons ends up, the British, they didn't want that. They were like, this is causing us a headache. So we're just going to split the territories of the main Omani, of the main, Muscati holdings. We're going to split the main Muscati holdings between the two warring brothers.
One gets Zanzibar.
Yes, they do this thing, this British imperial thing. It's kind of like, the school principal comes in and they're like, okay, you go, you have detention, and you get detention, but then you're going to go to this class. So one gets Muscat, and technically Muscat and Oman. The other one gets Zanzibar. Now, the problem is Zanzibar is much richer, and that's partly to do with the horrific labor regime that the British and their tool, Said al-Kabir, had imposed there, which was, they depended on enslaved labor and later on exploitative forms of labor there. But it also depended on a higher rate of agricultural fertility there. So Zanzibar was basically richer. What ended up happening is that after this split takes place, in the initial period of the split in the early 1860s, we have this idea that gets presented, which is that Muscat will get a subsidy from Zanzibar. But in effect, that never takes place, and essentially the British replace. They're like, okay, we'll pay the subsidy to keep the peace, but actually what they're doing by that is they end up controlling the state. So the Sayyids of Muscat become totally dependent on the British financially, which means that they lose any sense of independent power. So even though Muscat and Oman never were formally colonized, they end up falling under an extreme form of British control that might be even more intense than that control that was imposed on some colonies.
Yeah, they're client states and then they're client states. There are degrees to which a local ruling family is dependent on the bigger colonial power. And Muscat and Oman is an extreme case of near total dependency.
Right. And in the case of the interior in Oman, that angers the Ibadi elites and the tribal leaders and the religious scholars. Because remember, these are people that know colonialism from before and they don't like it. They have a concept of anti-colonialism. It's an Islamic concept. It's not the concept that we know today, but it's still a strong concept, which is that you should not be ruled by the unbelievers. And that's, regardless of its religious content, is still a concept of freedom. It saw the Sayyids of Muscat as basically being lowly vassals who had lowered themselves by falling into the rule of these non-Muslim outsiders that were playing with them like pawns. That leads to a major mobilization from the interior in multiple cases. You have an imam from the family itself even presented in the late 19th century, and they try to defeat the Sayyids of Muscat and expel them essentially and restore rule to its rightful owners, the imams, through that. That attempt fails because of British support. Later on, you have a threat coming from the interior, on the eve of the First World War, and the British are like, okay, we can't afford this. So they start actually, not only do they send troops there because they recognize the geostrategic importance of controlling Oman, especially in the context of a great war like that, but also they start thinking about building local military capacity for the local rulers in Muscat. And that unleashes that process. But in the meantime, they want to neutralize the threat from the interior. So they end up signing a treaty with the interior that essentially says, look, we don't care if you do an imamate, but keep that imamate away from us and away from the coast. And essentially, your territories will be the areas around the holy cities in the interior, or the learned religious cities in the interior, which are basically Nizwa and Rustaq. These are centers of ancient Islamic Ibadi learning. And we're going to give the coast, certain parts of the coast, to the Sultan of Muscat. And that treaty, which is called the Treaty of Sib, and it gets signed in September 1920, that treaty becomes basically the ruling arrangement until the British start seeing that there's oil potential in the interior. And that happens, of course, in the 1950s. So the 1950s, we have two things happening. One is the old imam with which the racial arrangement was undertaken falls ill. That starts in after the Second World War, 1945. The old imam gets ill, and then over the following 10 years, there's a push and pull between interior and coast. The old imam eventually dies in 54, and a new imam is elected, Imam Ghalib, but really his brother Talib gains influence in that imamate, and that imam clashes with the Sultan, because the Sultan is like, okay, I don't want to recognize these people's control over the interior now that I know that there's oil there. And certainly the British don't want to do that either. They want their companies to start exploring and prospecting, and indeed they do. So you end up having this big push that leads to the occupation of the interior, and of course it was during that period that we have a situation where that is presented as the reunification of Oman under the legitimate authority, that of the Sultan. Now, here's the little problem that happens. Yes, the Sultan initially manages to enter fairly easily and to defeat the imamate fairly easily. But the problem that he confronted is that Talib and Ghalib start exploring ways of talking to Egypt about this, and to Nasser. And they also open a link with the Saudis. And remember, at this stage, mid-50s, Egyptian-Saudi relations are fairly good.
Both countries at this point are aligned together against the Western imperialist Baghdad military pact. Egypt and Saudi Arabia are at this point allies rather than the leaders of resolutely opposed enemy camps that they'll soon become, a history that we detailed in the last episode.
Yes, and certainly, Saudi has its own agenda because it never recognized the boundaries of Oman. So it has an interest, it could expand even further into areas with more oil wealth. Why not? At worst, it can have a potential state under its influence in the form of the imamate. Even though, by the way, traditionally and of course historically, the biggest theological and religious and military threat to the imamate was from Wahhabi movement, or what this, of course, Wahhabis never call themselves Wahhabis. They call themselves the movement of monotheism. So that was the biggest threat against the imamate historically. But you end up with this strange alliance developing around that time, and Jamal Abdel Nasser has completely different considerations for this alliance, but the Saudis have a different set of calculations. We can talk about them in a second.
How does the rebellion erupt, and how does it then play out, and what is the significance of the Imamate's defeat?
What happens initially was as we said, initially you have this victory of the Sultan. So in 54, they're entering these territories. They're taking them over. They even take over the main territory with the oil wealth, which is Fahoud, and they're feeling victorious and really excited at this stage. But of course, if there's strong local opposition, what happens is Imam's brother Talib goes to Cairo and explains to the authorities there that he is willing to carry out a rebellion and he needs their help in doing that. Now, interestingly, and we have a very detailed description of this, by the way, by Fath al-Dib, who was in Arabic. Unfortunately, it's not available in English, but who was the head of the Egyptian Mukhabarat division, Egyptian intelligence division that dealt with Arab national liberation movements. He comes and he meets with this guy, and this is taking place in 56, just before Suez. So we have like a very interesting timing taking place. They end up, having this meeting. Gamal Abdel Nasser tells his intelligence operatives to go and explore the situation before making a decision. So he sends an envoy there, and he goes and explores the situation. And after an expedition, he comes back with a report that they should support this initiative. The support gets delayed by the tripartite aggression and attacks on Egypt. But eventually, in 57, there's Egyptian weapons being supplied. The Imam's brother Talib enters in 1957, and he comes in with several hundred people, with a force that has been trained in these Arab countries and supplied with Egyptian and Saudi help, and essentially regains the Imamate territory, which is totally humiliating for the British and the Sultan. Then we end up with a counterinsurgency led by the British for the following while. Basically, it's a very vicious counterinsurgency. It's concentrated around the Jabal al-Akhdar, the Green Mountain region, which is a good terrain for launching a revolt, but at the same time, it ends up the British use air power. And they bombard everybody very heavily, and they do indiscriminate bombardment. They do attacks on civilians. They do all the nasty counterinsurgency stuff that you can imagine, and essentially they force people into submission, especially after a huge attack that they launch in 1959 against the remaining revolutionaries in Jabal al-Akhdar. Now, that means that the forces of the Imamate get quashed on the ground. But two things had happened that are important for us for the rest of the story. One is there was enormous coverage of this in the Arab press and Arab media, especially in the most important Arab media, which was the Voice of the Arabs, being broadcast from Cairo. The second thing is that this occasions actually official investigations into the status of Oman and its colonial status, and at the level of the United Nations. So we end up with the question of Oman being presented to the United Nations, and you have all these UN reports for years following this revolution that continue to consider the question of Oman, and it's an item that gets mentioned and adopted by many states, including, by the way, the People's Republic of China promotes the question of Oman in its publications in this time. All the major Arab countries, they're talking about it. So that points out, that basically exposes the British control over the territory.
Let's turn to the foundation of the Dhofar Liberation Front. What were the social, economic, and political conditions imposed by the Sultan, backed, of course, again, by British imperial power, that would ultimately lay the groundwork for the Dhofari armed struggle against the Omani state?
So part of the story is connected to the Jabal al-Akhdar revolution, because what was happening across Oman, if you think about it in oppositional terms, was that the Sultan and his British backers were very, very unpopular. This was definitely the case in Dhofar, where people had tried to rebel against them on multiple occasions, where people felt that they were overtaxed, where people felt that they were under the weight of enormous restrictions as well. Sultan Said bin Taymour really imposed a set of restrictions on people's lives that were kind of extreme. By the way, some right-wing scholars now try to question that under the banner of revisionism and restoring agency to rulers. And I'm like, no, agency belongs to the people, not to the imperialist stooges in the region like Said bin Taymour, who was a pretty nasty type of ruler that really, really did restrict movement heavily. He did restrict education heavily. He did not provide services. He did not have a developmental serious vision. And this was very much connected to his view that if you did spread education, if you had a situation where people could move freely, then they would be able to conspire against you. They would be able to overthrow you. In many ways, he was very much indoctrinated in conservative British ideologies coming out of India and the colonization of India. This was a person that was influenced, had received their education in Ajmer College. This was a school that was training all these princely state figures in India. His entire way of thinking was colonial. And he even told one time a British advisor that was suggesting that maybe he needs to incorporate a more kind of developmental vision. He told him, this is why you lost India. It's because you educated them.
Yeah, when a British officials proposed opening schools, he said that's why you lost India. You educated the natives.
I mean, one big problem is they had a misreading of history. The British did not educate the natives enough in India for sure. They did not adopt or anywhere, by the way. This myth of empire being a developmental force is not accurate entirely, but He definitely has an anti-education agenda. He did open up very restricted schools for his followers and courtiers, and these were not really modern in their outlook or in the substance of their curricula.
I mean, it seems like there was a relationship between the Sultan's extreme conservatism and his extreme dependence on British power. Because he was a creature entirely of imperial power, he didn't depend upon his people for any support, which means he didn't need to invest anything to generate hegemony within Oman. But that also meant that he exercised no sort of hegemony amongst his people.
He did have a local network of sorts, but it was a narrow local network. And his father and his grandfather were so dependent on the British, but also they were not, at least according to his vision, financially wise. So he was obsessed with balancing the books, which meant, and his strategy for doing that is spend nothing on the people and extract from them as much as possible. What that means then is that the British cannot control you in your daily life. And by you, we're not talking about the country as a whole. We're talking about the Sultan. He wanted as much freedom for himself. And, some people assert that he was trying to achieve some independent vision. Now, I think all the historical evidence points out to the fact that he was very happy being under British tutelage when it came to foreign affairs and military affairs. His only concern was to have local control over internal affairs under him. So this was his vision for the country, a country that's dominated by Britain externally, and that's dominated by himself when it comes to its own internal function. I used the word dominated in the literal sense of the term, because his methods of control and social control were basically based on the stick. There was hardly any carrots offered by him for anybody.
How did Dhufari migrant workers in Kuwait end up intersecting with activists from the movement of Arab nationalists, also in Kuwait? And again, the movement of Arab nationalists is itself a group that draws its leadership in substantial part from Palestinians in the diaspora and is in general coalescing its leadership just amongst this very multinational Arab diaspora in Cairo, in Kuwait City. How did this sort of diasporic Arab movement of Arab nationalists intersect with this Dhufari diaspora? And then how did all these various strands of Dhufari society, some inclined to tribal allegiance, others to more modern political ideologies, how did all these facets of Dhufari society in Dhofar and in the diaspora, alongside these larger transnational Arab radical currents, how did they all come together to create a new revolutionary organization that in 1965 launched its armed struggle against the Sultanate?
So against this reality of severe underdevelopment, lack of education, lack of roads, lack of schools, and also political tyranny and total lack of political freedoms, you have this situation where the Dhafaris are increasingly forced to work outside of Dhofar. They turn into migrant laborers. There's many push factors that are pushing people out, and there are also pull factors from the surrounding region. In the oil era, you have this transformation taking place, especially after the 1940s. You have the coincidence of a situation where you had major depression taking place in Dhofar, coinciding with the growth of work opportunities outside of it. There's an interesting sector, and really, if you want to think of it in sectoral terms economically, that has a bearing on how people organize eventually for a revolution. So one interesting sector for work for Dhafaris was the military sector, because the British had decided that these were a martial race, what they would call a martial race. And of course, we do not endorse this racialist view of the world.
But they viewed them kind of like Gurkhas in India or something.
Totally. Because they thought these are Highlanders, they're good fighters. You have all these British descriptions of the Dhafaris as brave, as great shots. They know how to use a rifle well. They're good with the terrain because they're accustomed. It's like a whole British outlook on who makes a good fighter, and of course it's collectively it's based on collective analysis. So they're like, okay, this group, this collectivity makes good fighters, so we're gonna recruit them for the security services that we're building across the Gulf. As oil gets discovered, we need to build up security forces to be able to protect the regimes across the region. This means that you have all these Dhafaris being recruited to the Bahrain Defense Force and into the Crucial Oman Scouts, which is basically becomes later on the army of the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. This is an interesting situation. And interestingly, they're used in the counterinsurgency against the Green Mountain Revolt, against the Jabal Akhdar Revolt. This is a very interesting situation. You have these people who are disgruntled with the Sultan, but through being absorbed into these British military structures, they're actually called upon, and essentially they end up fighting in support of the Sultan. And they love them in the Jabal Akhdar Revolt because, again, as part of this martial race theory, they're like, we need people who are Highlanders that can fight in high altitudes. They end up, therefore, defeating or contributing to the defeat of the rebels in the northern part of Oman. But in the meantime, that increases their sense of alienation from the Sultan. And that sense of alienation increases as people begin to see new development programs operating in different countries across the Arabian Peninsula, especially countries that were beginning to benefit from the oil industry. That, produces another section of Dhofari labor besides the military one, which is there was Dhofari labor in the oil industry. Those workers in the oil industry that get recruited to the movement of Arab nationalists in Kuwait, they're encountered by the leader of that movement, Dr. Ahmed al-Khatib. They get attracted to the movement of Arab nationalists because it gives them a sense of belonging and affirmation in a space that was hostile to them as potential as migrant laborers. Not everybody, this one of the biggest challenges faced by migrant laborers is this notion of foreignness that you're confronted with in everyday interactions. If you follow the movement of Arab nationalist theory, these are not foreigners. They're in their home country, like any Arab would be. So that was the attitude of the Kuwaiti Arab nationalists. And for Dhafaris, this was especially important because although they identified as Arabs ethnically, they had their own Southern Arabian languages. And additionally, in terms of their actual physical look, it's definitely a look that would be similar to that. And again, Yemen has a lot of that as well. Like it's similar to the an East African kind of look with some Indian influences. I mean, there's so much intermixing in that area. So what happens next is something special happens in relation to the Dhufaris in the history of the movement to Arab nationalists. Normally, cadres in that movement are recruited individually and they join through a very complicated induction process. What happens here is the movement of Arab nationalists actually absorbs the Dhufaris en masse. So they come in and they recruit dozens of people. I cannot think of any case in the history of the movement of Arab nationalists where that happened in that style. And then that means that they set up a special education program for them, on Arab nationalism, on pan-Arabism, on in different aspects of anti-colonialism. That process happens in the late 50s. And you have this very interesting situation where this produces a political leadership of sort that has a stronger ideological background and grounding than any that had existed ever in Dhufari history. Now, I should note, up to this stage, there was not a single university graduate that was actually from Dhufari at this stage. And that meant that this first kind of wave of people that received this education in Kuwait was really very privileged by Dhufari standards. They had access to knowledge that was considered to be very modern knowledge. Some of them started to essentially use this to be able to recruit more people because that gave them social capital and it gave them the ability to talk about ideas and explain ideas that had existed outside of Dhufar in ways that are legible to their own compatriots, but they themselves had to receive these ideas in vernacular forms. So it was a very complicated process, but the movement of Arab nationalists played that facilitation role, let's say, in terms of the encounter between these Dhufari cadres and these modern ideologies that were circulating in the region at the time. Now, all of these cadres were attracted to Nasserism, though. Whether you read or you did not read, you were able to listen to the radio. The people were listening to the speeches of Jamal Abdel Nasser, and they were inspired by them. And some of these speeches alluded to the realities in the Gulf, including in Oman, and especially around the Jabal Akhdar situation that they started learning more about that. And eventually, you had this idea of establishing a unified front that would bring together the Faris from different backgrounds to be able to overthrow the Sultan. Initially, they thought of why don't we do a coup within the Sultan's army? They make an attempt at an assassination, it fails. And then they explore other options. Eventually, they come to the idea that they have to establish a unified front. And that's something that the Egyptian officials and Jamal Abdel Nasser pushes them to do. He tells especially the movement of Arab nationalist cadres, the Dhufari ones, that you have to work with others, even if they have not received the same level of education, even if they have a different outlook, even if they're coming from these security forces in the Gulf. So those that came from the security forces, they had a Dhufari Soldiers Association. The ones that came from the movement of Arab nationalists, of course, were part of this bigger pan-Arab movement. And then you had a third current and operated under the banner of Dhufari Charitable Association. And that was raising money for starting a revolt against the Sultan, but under the banner of building mosques and charitable projects of that sort. So they were telling people, we're collecting donations to build a mosque, but in reality, they were, of course, trying to procure weapons and that sort of thing. So these three forces essentially unify into a single body called the Dhufar Liberation Front. And I want people to really think about that, because this is the era of fronts, in the Arab arena and elsewhere. And in the Arab arena, again, it's Nasser that's really pushing for this front model. He thinks that it's important for different forces to unify so that they can overthrow the colonialists. But that front model initially works in Dhufar for launching the revolution, but it does not last for too long. Because you have one party in this front, one group in this front, that has a clear ideology, which is a movement of Arab nationalists, and that has a notion of politics that is crystallized. But then you have others that do not have such an outlook. And it's very difficult to merge these kind of forces. You have others that had for example, a tribalist vision, and you have others that had a separatist vision. Some just wanted Dhufar to separate from the Sultan, expel the Sultan, Dhufar for the Dhufaris. Others wanted like some kind of tribal access to potential oil fields. And that's why they joined the revolution. But when it came to the movement of Arab nationalists, they were against both tribalism and separatism. They were saying what we need is a bigger vision. We need to unify the whole Arab world, and we're going to start by unifying everything from Aden to Kuwait, which means the whole of the Arabian Peninsula.
Programmatically speaking, how did that translate into the concrete launching of the armed struggle in 65?
Well, what happened was basically a lot of issues were deferred. The future outlook of the Dhufari liberation, how it would look like, was essentially deferred because there were very different ideas. But there was like a program that emphasized the need to expel the British colonialists and the need to overthrow their local clients, the Al-Busaid. And that's how it was basically the first call for the revolution in 1965 focuses on these elements. However, the social question comes in with force a couple of years later. And this is where we have a transformation happening in the revolution. Initially, it's launched under the Dhufar Liberation Front in 1965 and the 9th of June. But then you enter into a period, a couple of years later, where the revolutionaries have to contend with major changes taking place across the Arab arena. Most importantly, the 67 defeat. And that forces a change in their orientation.
Let's hopscotch over to South Yemen, just across the western border from Dhofar. Revolutionary movements emerged there to counter British power, which was a British colony in Aden and then protectorates surrounding it. Ultimately, there's a revolutionary victory in 1967. The National Liberation Front took power amid the British military withdrawal, all of which, and this is why this is one episode, all of which was a huge boost for the revolutionary struggle next door in Dhofar. How did the NLF emerge from the movement of Arab nationalists? And then how, from the 1963 beginning of their revolutionary struggle, a period that the British called the Aden Emergency, how over 4 years of armed struggle did the NLF and also their rivals in the Front for the Liberation of Occupied South Yemen, how did the rebel forces manage to force the British withdrawal from such an important colony?
So, the importance of Aden, first of all, let's just start by saying Aden was way more important than any other part of southern Arabia for much of the 19th century and the early 20th century. Until the discovery of oil, this is the most important prize in this region. And that has to do with military purposes, geopolitical purposes relating to India and to global trade and to its unique position as a coaling station.
Red Sea, Suez Canal, naval base.
It's so important in so many levels. So what we end up having, though, is a situation where you have British direct colonial control in Aden itself, but then you have the hinterland, the surrounding region, in which they don't have a full plan for control until much later. Their initial objective was, we need this port, we need everything to be fine in it. Later on, they find that the defense of this port will depend on an arrangement that will be useful for containing any forces from the interior that could threaten their position. Problem was complicated by the fact that the interior had so many different small statelets within it that were controlled by different tribal confederations. Yes, you did have a royal colony in the form of Aden, but but then you have these statelets around it. The British wanted to have an orderly kind of arrangement for. That's why they pushed for a federation of them. They did not believe that these statelets could survive alone. And this is why they say, look, we're going to create this thing, which is a federation of emirates in South Arabia. And they call it the Federation of South Arabia.
Dry run for the United Arab Emirates, in a sense. A failed dry run.
Directly. Absolutely, it is. And actually, one of the most important early writings of the movement of Arab nationalists was an attack on this federation. They called it an Ittihad Muzayyaf, a fake federation, saying that this is a federation designed to protect imperialism, not to unify Arab space. So in response to these political changes that were happening, you have the situation where the establishment of this federation, the discussions leading up to it, encourage a sense of movement on the part of movement of Arab nationalist cadres from this part of the world, from South Yemen. Many of these leaders had either joined the movement in Kuwait or elsewhere, but they had essentially come to view the position of the movement as a force that would help them launch an armed struggle. They were demanding, basically, that they launch an armed struggle as soon as possible against the British in this region. They saw an opportunity to overthrow the British arrangement there and to expel the British from the whole area if they were offered the right sort of support. The movement of Arab nationalists produces a structure that, again, in the language of popular fronts, that they call the National Liberation Front. And let's not forget here that the National Liberation Front was exactly the name of the structure that operated in Algeria, I should note, except that was, in the case of Algeria, it was, of course, designed and developed earlier. But the reason why I mentioned this is that it's so important to never forget the influence of the Algerian Revolution across the Arab sphere at this stage, including on the Yemeni struggle, but not only on that. We spoke earlier about its importance for the Palestinian arena. So you had a situation where the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, Fatah, was of course also modeled on the FLN model. So this is one issue to note. Another issue to note is that the Algerian Revolution starts or encourages a process where people view armed struggle as essential. So you form a National Liberation Front and then you carry out an armed struggle, and that's how you gain your freedom. That was basically the lesson that was provided by Algeria. Now, this concrete lesson coinciding with the spread of Nasserism and a situation where you had an overthrow of the imamate or the imam in Sana'a in 1962. All of these factors were coalescing to create a situation where people who were part of the movement of Arab nationalists and belonged to the Yemeni, branch, or who were Yemenis in that movement, they found it to be an opportune moment to launch a struggle. So this struggle, the preparations for it require, of course, procuring weapons. They require a training. It's not a simple thing to do. You have this process that goes on into the preparation phase, which eventually leads, of course, to the start of guerrilla warfare operations. By the time we get to 1964, these operations have really intensified. 63, we have a situation where a grenade is thrown at British officials, and then you have an emergency declared, but that leads to the launch of a proper kind of rural-based revolution, essentially, or what the British call an insurgency or an emergency, combined with forms of urban warfare that develop in Aden itself.
We've talked so much about how the movement of Arab nationalists was the key on-the-ground proxy for Nasserism across the Arab world. How was it then that the movement created National Liberation Front came into conflict with Nasser over South Yemen, with Nasser supporting a rival Front for the Liberation of Occupied South Yemen, or FLOSSY? Why did this conflict take place in the way that it did, and how did the NLF ultimately take power innate, including by winning power against Flossie.
So as we know, the movement of Arab nationalists was experiencing a left turn in this period. In the Yemeni branch, we had major development, where the NLF was increasingly shifting to the left and adopting an increasingly Marxist ideology. This causes tension because initially, there's a unified scene where everybody can be for Nasser and everybody's pro Nasser, and that can bring together forces from different backgrounds, including Adani forces that come from the trade unionist background in Aden. Because if we want to think about this structurally, you have the basis of this movement. You have this strong and old and powerful Adani trade unionist tradition, and then you have those figures that come from the surrounding countryside, essentially, and from Hadramaut and the areas outside of the royal colony of Aden, that come from a different kind of background and have a different kind of experience of organizing, and they come from different social background as well. It's a much more tribal environment in those areas. Although sometimes Yemeni comrades don't like to talk in these terms, the reality is like the tribal dimension became clear in subsequent conflicts that took place. We can't, it's part of social reality. And it has to be taken into account. So, but you have this rural versus town kind of dimension, and then you have also, other dimensions playing into this. In any case, the Marxist orientation, as it gets hold, you have tensions appearing. There's tensions with the Egyptians happening. And there's also critiques of Nasser's handling of the situation in North Yemen as well. And even Nasser's handling or his security establishment's handling of the revolutionaries, NLF revolutionaries themselves. That produces a lot of tension, and eventually you have a split. One of the major trade unionist figures that had joined the NLF and that was closer to the Nasserist line, Abdel Razzaq, he disapproves of the Marxist turn. He sees it as extreme. He's grounded in more kind of British Labour Party type of politics and outlook. It's more of a social democratic orientation, and with the Nasserist bent, of course, in this case. That's much milder than what these more Marxist NLF figures are demanding, and eventually you do have a split taking place because of that.
Nasser even, after Flossie is formed with Nasser's support, Nasser even imprisons the head of the NLF, who's in Cairo at the time.
A bunch of them, not just the head. So their whole delegation is imprisoned. But then, of course, they end up getting released. But this all causes like major problems. I mean, it was an attempt to force them into an agreement, but these kind of tactics did not work with the Yemenis. And it caused like a major alienation actually in the south, which is why the NLF just increasingly took a more radical line. Now, one important thing to note is this was the only successful revolutionary armed struggle in the Arabian Peninsula, in the history of the Arabian Peninsula.
And it also became the only communist state in the Middle East.
It did become the only officially Marxist state in the Middle East, yes. A state that officially espoused Marxism, absolutely. The People's Democratic Republic of Yemen was seen as a most radical type of state to emerge in the region. Of course, that had its own complications, Daniel, because here's the issue that with this situation, and we can talk about it later, but there are challenges when you're very poor and you adopt big slogans and ideologies like that. So the NLF end up like having a dual battle. Essentially, they have an internal battle against what they see as a force that is politically milder and not progressive enough from their perspective, which is Flossie. And at the same time, of course, their main target is getting the British out. And they do achieve that in a spectacular victory that happens in 1967. Of course, 1967 is usually remembered as a year of defeat for Arab countries, but there was a major victory in southern Arabia, which was that of forcing the British Empire out of a strategically important place like Aden was quite a big deal. It was downplayed by the British. The British, like all other powerful empires of that sort, are quick to forget their defeats, and they just incorporate it into this language that essentially they dismiss these spaces and move on after wreaking havoc in them. But the people on the ground remember them, and of course they deal with their mixed legacies that came out of that. And between 67 and 69, there's still an ongoing conflict within the NLF itself that gets resolved eventually when the Marxist wing fully achieves victory in 69.
What was the significance of the NLF victory next door in Oman, where the Dhofar Liberation Front continued its armed struggle against the Omani state? You write, quote, "Rarely has a state given so much and materially gained so little from its support for a cause. Yet South Yemen continued to support the revolution to the very end. By all accounts, Dhofari leaders were treated as equal comrades, not to be intervened with or told what to do, free in their decision-making and unfettered in their mode of organization."
With the South Yemeni victory, you have this enormous support that's afforded to Dhofar. And at this stage, it's important to note that I've never seen, or I don't know of any example where there had been such steadfast support that really posed a threat to the national security of South Yemen. And that's always been a conundrum. I mean, different people have tried to answer it. Fred Halliday tried to answer it in his study on South Yemen's foreign policy. I don't think he gave a fully clear answer. In my view, my own answer was that this was both connected to an ideological dimension, but also a certain view of the need to spread the revolution so as to protect the Yemeni revolution itself, that it can't just be on the defensive. But additionally, I explained it with reference to the idea that the South Yemeni revolution had not yet entered the bureaucratization phase that many revolutions enter during the period when it was supporting the Dhofar liberation struggle. So if you think about it, many early revolutionary powers, before they end up bureaucratizing, I'm not saying that they have to bureaucratize, but they often do. There's still a passion, there's still a fire, there's still a commitment, there's still the ideological dimension being strong. Some people have a different outlook. They immediately say, well, it's all just realpolitik and realist politics. I don't think that's a good understanding of how revolutionaries operate. Revolutionaries, at the end of the day, are human beings. Revolutionary organizations, when they take power, they are comprised of human beings. Ideals do play a role in their outlooks, and definitely there was an idealistic dimension relating to the Yemeni support for the Dhofar liberation struggle. They were born around the same time. They're the neighboring struggle. There's so much in common. So that's that side. On the material side, it's right next door. If the revolution were to succeed there, and there is an existing revolutionary struggle that was there that had a shot at success. If it were to succeed, that would have enhanced the position of the Yemeni revolution at a time when it was surrounded by hostile states that were controlled by Britain, and increasingly they were entering the American orbit, these states. And of course, the biggest menace was Saudi Arabia, which was already within the American orbit. And so the South Yemenis had a lot to think about, and it would have been beneficial for them to have more revolutionary states in their surroundings. So I think it's a combination of both idealism and practical necessity.
I'm Astra Taylor, and you're listening to The Dig with Daniel Denver, a podcast that helps us understand the past so we can organize for a better future. That's why you should support the show at patreon.com/thedig.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com, and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is How to Abolish Prisons: Lessons from the Movement Against Imprisonment by Rachel Hertzing and Justin Piche. Critics of abolition sometimes castigate the movement for its utopianism, but in this book, longtime organizers Herzing and Piche reveal a movement that has made the struggle for abolition as real as the institutions that it fights against. Drawing on extensive interviews with abolitionist crews all over North America, they provide a stunning snapshot of a movement's thinking and organizing in motion. As Maya Shenwar puts it, this illuminating, grounded documentation of real efforts to dismantle carceral systems makes liberatory visions tangible. How to Abolish Prisons is an antidote to hopelessness. Find How to Abolish Prisons at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. The NLF victory in South Yemen in 1967 was just one of many very consequential events taking place in the region around that time. First and most importantly, there was the catastrophic Arab defeat in the June 67 war with Israel, which had a huge impact everywhere in the Arab world. And we'll get into that in a lot more detail in our next episodes on the Palestinian Revolution. Then in January 1968, the British government announced that its troops would withdraw from the Gulf by the end of 1971. And that, after so many years of the British dominating the region, that set off huge alarm bells for their client regimes, who became rather anxious about their security, which led consequentially to the formation of the United Arab Emirates. What impact did these events have for the struggle in Dhofar and for revolutionary politics across the Gulf? In July 1968, Gulf branches of the movement of Arab nationalists met in Dubai, and amid these really heavy criticisms of the organization's Kuwaiti leadership, they essentially seceded from the organization, creating in its place the popular revolutionary movement in Oman and the Arab Gulf. And then in August 1968, in a conference in Dhofar, the Dhofar Liberation Front remade itself into the Popular Front for the Liberation of Occupied Arab Gulf, PFLOAG. How did all these tumultuous events of 1967 remake the broader movement of Arab nationalists in the Gulf region, and then more specifically, the Dhofari Revolution?
The 1967 war was a moment of crisis, obviously, for all the political forces in the region. But it affected the movement of Arab nationalists in very specific ways, because the movement of Arab nationalists had connected itself so closely to Nasser's leadership. And when you have a big defeat like this one, then caused a crisis of confidence in that leadership, but also it led to the growth of currents within the movement of Arab nationalists that had long been demanding the adoption of a more radical line within the organization.
Though those people previously were the most hardcore Nasserists, right? They wanted to dissolve the organization into Nasserism, these same people.
Yes, but they did have a way of addressing this contradiction. The rare privilege of being the only person who was allowed to interview Mohsen Ibrahim on these questions, specifically on Dhofar in the 60s and the Gulf arena in Yemen. And he, of course, led a big chunk of that left faction. And later on, of course, was to play a role in the establishment of the branch of the movement in the Lebanese arena. So Mohsen Ibrahim, the way he defended their previous stance on Nasserism was to say that they felt that there was a contradiction between Nasser and his security services. And they distinguished between what they decided was a more revolutionary line that was taken by Nasser and a more conservative line that was taken by security services and its intelligence services. So they kind of saw that there was a difference in treatment, in approach, in discourse between the two. And they might have been right to some extent, although, of course, there was no doubt also that after 67, they had to reevaluate even that stance and they had to adopt a more radical critique than that. So the critique they arrived at after 67 was that the Arab struggle in the previous decade had been dominated by what they considered to be petty bourgeois leaderships, which meant that these leaderships were unable to carry out a program of long-term people's war. In advocating such a program, the younger cadres of the movement of Arab nationalists were very much influenced by the Vietnamese model, especially, but also by the Chinese model. And they were saying, look, in order to be able to liberate land and to be able to put up a strong fight against a state like that, like a settler colonial state like the State of Israel, you need a long-term people's war. You can't just come and depend on building up these classical militaries and expect them to bring big victories. And of course, anybody, this was at the height of the Vietnam War. This was taking place as that horrible situation was experienced by the Vietnamese people. Of course, there was a Vietnamese revolution and that's, by the way, the term we use in the Arab region. We don't just say Harb Vietnam, there's also Thawra al-Vietnamiyya. In radical circles, that's how it's referred to. You don't just say the Vietnam War, we say like the Vietnamese Revolution, because that's how it's conceptualized, as a revolution against initially French colonialism and then American imperialism.
And that's what Che meant when he said 2, 3, many Vietnams. He was evoking these sorts of anti-colonial revolutions that were proceeding along the Vietnamese lines in places like Dhofar.
Absolutely. And this is why the movement of Arab nationalists overall, not just in Dhofar, elsewhere, everywhere, was saying, look, had these leaderships not been of a petty bourgeois background, they would have been willing to sacrifice in ways that did not exist in something like the 67 war. And sacrifice for them meant you had a relationship that had existed between North and South Vietnam. So North Vietnam, of course, was willing to risk being bombarded, being attacked, being undermined in ways that the Arab states surrounding Palestine were not.
In other words, the Arabs, North Vietnam was more willing to sacrifice far more to liberate South Vietnam than the surrounding Arab states were to liberate Palestine.
Yeah, and the analysis of the movement of Arab nationalists at that stage was that they attributed this to the petty bourgeois nature of the leadership of these struggles. Because the petty bourgeoisie does not want to have its cities destroyed, does not have the capacity to risk major economic losses. That social composition of the leadership and what it represents and the social forces it represents, according to this analysis, meant they could not put up the necessary fight and needed for the liberation of Palestine. So you had, first of all, a transformation in the case of the movement of Arab nationalists from a previous position where they had been even critiquing Fatah for carrying out guerrilla warfare. They were saying, you're actually entangling Nasser and the progressive Arab front in a potential war that they don't want at this stage. So, and they should be left with the freedom to decide when they launch the liberation of Palestine. Of course, on the Fatah side, they were saying, look, they're not going to launch the liberation of Palestine anytime soon. So what are Palestinian people supposed to do? Just sit there and wait until these leaderships decide that they will do that, and who knows if they ever will. So that was the kind of initial discussion, and in fact. And the idea of guerrilla struggle that was led by Fatah had been criticized heavily in articles by the main writer of the movement of Arab nationalists, the most famous one, Ghassan Kanafani, who later gets assassinated by the Mossad, and who later becomes very much identified with the concept of armed struggle. Now, interestingly, the movement of Arab nationalists was not against the idea of armed struggle again, but it very much wished to connect it with coordination with the Egyptian leadership. That's why it was always careful on when it would launch a struggle. It tried to coordinate with the Egyptians around Yemen and South Yemen, and that caused, by the way, when Abdel Nasser started Flossie, that caused a crisis between the central leadership of the movement of Arab nationalists and the National Liberation Front, because in Yemen, because the National Liberation Front were like, you guys, we come from this movement. And you're coming here trying to negotiate between us and Nasser and trying to, essentially it's not helping our direction. It's not connected to our local grounding. Now, of course, you had a situation where other Gulf branches had their own complaints in relation to the central leadership. For the Gulf region, the main leadership operated out of Kuwait. It was not George Habash or Ani Al-Hindi or these people from Palestine, Syria that were running the show in relation to the Gulf. It was Dr. Ahmed Al-Khatib and the Kuwaiti leadership in Kuwait. Again, these branches, especially the southern Arabian branches, but also some other branches that had undergone a process of major radicalization in that period, and particularly the Bahraini branch, which was very important, they were criticizing heavily Ahmed al-Khatib and the leadership as being petty bourgeois, as not being radical enough. There were major challenges. And as a result, you have a split in Kuwait, kind of more youthful people like that were more influenced by Maoist ideas, more radical ideas. We're like, well, we can carry out urban guerrilla warfare and let's do some bombs here and there and let's start like actions. And they did like during the visit of the Shah, they planted some bombs but it didn't go very far and they got eventually rounded up. And, one of the leading figures in that movement, Ahmed Rubai, and ended up becoming an education minister in Kuwait. And ended up being absorbed into the government, but that was later on, But you had different currents taking place. Definitely, the Yemenis were unhappy with the national leadership. The Bahrainis were not, and in Dhufar they were not. That's why they decided to found a more radical Gulf network that you referred to earlier, Daniel. What you ended up out of this situation, you had two major developments take place. On a regional level, you had the establishment of basically a network that would coordinate revolutionary action across the Gulf. And then on the local level, you had the transformation taking place in Dhofar itself, where the only active armed struggle in the Gulf region was taking place. Because remember, by now South Yemen had gained its independence. Dhofar was still carrying out an armed struggle. The Dhofari struggle started in 1965. The South Yemeni struggle, the revolution started in 1963. The October Revolution there. So you had a couple of years difference between them. The South Yemenis, of course, achieved their freedom earlier. And then you had a situation where the Dhufaris were, first of all, very much influenced by the developments in Yemen. They felt now emboldened. The movement of Arab nationalist branch in Dhofar, which was, remember, part of the Dhofar Liberation Front at this stage. It had established an alliance with forces with tribalist forces and secessionist forces that it didn't necessarily, fully agree with. They felt now that they're in a stronger position than these other forces because their sister branch, the Movement of Arab Nationalist branch, just won a big struggle in the country that's right next door, which means that now they could have supply lines. They could have a diplomatic support. They could have the kind of support that we discussed earlier in this episode.
And so the movement of Arab, the significance of the August 1968 convention in Dhofar is essentially the movement of Arab nationalist left-wing faction seizing control of the entire Dhofar Liberation Front.
Yeah, it seizes control over the whole front. They carry out a major conference, the Hamrin Conference, in which they adopt a more radical program. And their program essentially says, look, we're going to be adopting a Marxist turn here, first of all. So we're no longer like catering to the kind of lowest common denominator. We're going to come out fully as a struggle that wants to pursue Marxism. We're gonna also carry out a struggle that will tackle social questions, including the questions of women's liberation and the questions of property, and we're gonna carry out a struggle that has huge regional aims. So hence the name. Before, the name was the Dhofar Liberation Front. Now they come up with this very ambitious title: the Popular Front for the liberation of the occupied Arab Gulf. That means, and by their definitions, that means everything from Aden to Kuwait, which means they want everything, okay? They're not going modest here. They continue adopting this line for the next while, but then eventually they have to adjust it for reasons that I guess we'll touch upon in a sec.
By the late 1960s, what was the Dhofar Liberation Front, now the Popular Front for the Liberation of the Occupied Arab Gulf, they began to make some important advances, to win some important victories, and the tide in many ways seemed to be turning against the Sultanate. What did the guerrilla war look like on the ground in strategic terms? And what in exchange, what sort of counterinsurgency operation were the British and Sultan organizing in response?
On the ground, what you had was a stronghold of the Sultan was the main town in this region, which was called Salalah. And then the surrounding coastal towns around it. There's Dhofar is comprised of a coastal strip, and then you have a mountain range ascending above it, and then you also have a desert portion. So the coastal strip is very important for the Sultan because that's where the major towns are there. That's where the settled centers are there. So Taqa, Mirbat, of course, Salalah as being the biggest. Now, the Sultanic authority basically at this stage was so weak. The British felt that, look, it would be a waste of time to try to fully control the mountains now. The best that we can do is ensure that we have a grounded base in the main areas that we care about. The most important being Salalah, because that's the main population center, but also it's where you have an RAF base. So the Royal Air Force, the British Royal Air Force had long had a base there. So they needed to protect that because that is the main source of supplies for them. And it's also the main source of air power, something that the revolutionaries did not have, of course. So the British, at the same time, were seeking to have some strategic interventions in the mountain. To be able to do that, they needed to have the equipment to be able to do that. So they needed helicopters, they needed all sorts of equipment. And this became a bone of contention between them and the Sultan because they were asking for major military spending. He was not willing to commit enough on that front, even though, he was more open to military spending than other areas of spending, but it was not enough according to the British demands. So he had a crisis. He was not willing to commit the necessary funds to be able to do that. And more importantly, from a British perspective, they were proposing these plans, and they had these intelligence officers on the ground, including one that was to play a role later on in the future history of Oman. This sketchy character called Tim Landon, who later dies, many years later, as one of the biggest and largest landowners in England. And this guy Tim Landon became an advisor to the Sultan Qaboos later on, the son of Sultan Said bin Taimur. But in the Said bin Taimur era, he had actually proposed a plan, saying, look, in order to destroy the revolutionaries, what we need to do is to activate local tribal rivalries and to essentially create conditions in which these more ideological folks that have taken control over this movement are cut off from their social base. And to do that, we need to pay a lot of money to a lot of the old leaderships, especially the sheikhs, these chiefs, that were very traditional in mindset. They were not particularly political in the modern sense of the word, as in subscribing to ideologies or whatever. They represented the interests of the leading sections of their tribes, and they represented in some ways their own individual interests. They wanted to have big amounts of property, and they wanted to have money, and they wanted to have social prestige. So they're relatively easy to buy if you're willing to invest enough funds. And secondly, you want to be able to also invest enough funds to be able to create a development program that would encourage people towards quietism. You want the ordinary people to say, oh, look, the Sultan just dug a well for us. So now we have nice fresh water. Oh, the Sultan just built a school. Oh, what a nice guy. Is so generous. And this is the basic fundamental premise of British counterinsurgency at the stage. And they call this the hearts and minds approach. That's the approach they were trying to promote. Now, Said bin Taymur was not willing to spend enough in that direction, even though, again, he's beginning to make oil money now. So in the past, the British used to understand why he wouldn't want to spend so much because he was trying to balance the books. Now, he has an enormous surplus. The guy is making oil money, but he's not spending any of it. It's there sitting in the bank and just accumulating. And although he tries to hint that he'll do a project here and there, it doesn't fully work for him. So British counterinsurgency suffers a set of setbacks in this period. The revolutionaries are able to recruit heavily because also the British are basically, carrying out operations that are brutal and that entail indiscriminate bombardment in many cases, burning villages. They create these zones in which it's okay to bomb anybody, shoot anybody. They attack water sources. They try to basically make the people thirsty. They're poisoning main water sources. By doing that, they're also attacking people's cattle and camels. This is a society in the highlands that depends on herding primarily. We know that there's been a long tradition of starving the people as a way of dominating them on the part of imperialist powers, including in this country, the United States, where, of course, the destruction of large swaths of herds of buffaloes and other important cattle for indigenous peoples was part of the war, the colonial war that was launched on the original inhabitants of this country, the original people of it. So the similar tactics were used by the British in Dhufar and elsewhere. They're like, let's kill these cows, let's kill the camels, let's just create a situation where these people's livelihoods are threatened if they do not ally with us. And then they do something even nastier, which is they carry out this thing called the sardine blockade. And that's a strategy that the Sultan encourages. He's like, you know what? Your cattle outside the monsoon season depends, after the few months after the monsoon, when they've already eaten up all the grass, and we've mentioned this earlier in this episode. After that, they need to eat sardines from the coast because they have no other source of food. So he does a sardine blockade. And that starves the cows, which means that the people are starved because they can't milk them and they can't derive from them their essential necessities of life.
A group called the National Democratic Front for the Liberation of Oman and the Arab Gulf tried to start a revolution outside of Dhofar in the interior of Oman that was modeled off the Cuban revolutionary FOCO theory. Now this National Front, if I have it right, was a sister organization to the Dhofari revolutionaries because it was part of this popular revolutionary movement in Oman and the Arab Gulf that the group that broke off from the movement of Arab nationalists that we were discussing a little while back. Anyhow, it escalated British unease over the Sultan's resistance to reform. And that led to the British finally in 1970 moving to oust the Sultan and replace him with his son. And the coup was presented and mythologized by the British, you write, as led by the Sultan's son, Qaboos, which was totally false. It was the British who backed the coup because of all of these contradictions that were building up in the Sultanate that were putting the Sultan at risk of losing the war and thus the British at risk of losing their client. And these were contradictions you lay out that the armed revolutionary struggle had dramatically heightened. You write, quote, "The Sultanate was an outpost of the Raj that had, remarkably, survived into the post-colonial era. Revolutionary activity was the primary pressure that was pushing that structure towards the brink, occasioning a conflict of political cultures between colonial conservatives, the Sultan and his British advisors, and colonial developmentalists, the British men on the spot, Shell," you're referring to the oil company there, and regional neighbors. Due to revolutionary pressure, there was a growing British resolve to strengthen the army substantially, transforming it from an instrument of containment to an aggressive tool in pursuit of state building and the introduction of rentierist developmental strategies. In resisting these policies, the Sultan was on a collision course with his imperial patrons. Lay this out. What sort of state was the Sultan insisting on running, and why amid the revolution in Dhofar, the Sultan's insistence on the way of doing things the way he was doing them become so intolerable for the British that they orchestrated what you would describe as a colonial coup against him?
So the Sultan, as I suggested earlier, was essentially not implementing a developmental agenda fast enough for the British. His heart was not in it. He did not want to build hundreds of schools in the country. He was hesitant about developing the road network. He was hesitant about developing the water network. And now you have this new trend in this new historiography, which is really infused by colonialism and conservatism, that tries to say, oh, actually, no, he was a developmentalist, but it's just the British were interfering with him. There's this attempt to rehabilitate Said bin Taymour, which I find totally objectionable. It's coming mainly, by the way, from Israeli circles. There's this guy in the Moshe Dayan Center that pursues this line. Others connected to that, they echo him, and it's becoming very popular in certain, ruling circles in the Gulf, but also like in amongst British circles, because what it does is it lets them off the hook. It lets both the imperialists and their client off the hook. Said bin Taymour did not develop the country. He drew up a couple of development plans that were, by the way, very limited, by just pointing out to the fact that there were 3 schools here. That shows that he was interested in education. I'm like, that's a country that needed hundreds of schools. Okay, there was no university. There was no serious investment in infrastructure. There was no investment in anything. There were severe restrictions on people's lives. So there was what you would call a great deal of surplus repression, to use Marcusean terms, since we referred to Marcuse earlier here. By the British were like, okay, we want the necessary repression, but we want the surplus repression to be kind of reduced, because that's just causing a disgruntlement. And they've had this conversation with him on multiple occasions, and they've had this discussion amongst themselves on multiple occasions. Historically, though, they kept on saying, look, this guy is a tried and tested ally of Britain to the very end. He's more British than the British. He was cheering for us even during the tripartite aggression on Suez. Nobody was doing that in the region. Even Britain's closest allies were too careful about that. He goes out of his way to ensure continuation of British presence in Oman. He wants us here. At the same time, however, it was clear that he's not doing them or himself a favor by not adjusting his methods and starting to invest the oil money in these programs that they had outlined for him. At the same time, you had pressure from within his family. His brother, Tariq bin Taymour, who's the father of the current Sultan, actually, that brother was flirting with ideas of modernization, including political change. He was saying, we should have a constitutional monarchy, and I want to come back and launch a development program with a constitutional monarchy plan. There were multiple options coming down there, but the British dismissed those internal family rifts. What they did care about, though, was that you had this revolutionary attempt in the north of Oman, around the same time when they were doing really badly in Dhufar, when they had pretty much lost control over the highlands and only had partial control over the coast. They're now dealing with a second front in the heartland of Oman, in the north, not in the periphery that was Dhufar, in the central area that's next to the capital, next to the oil wells, next to everything. And that plot recruited people who included folks from families that were supposed to be loyal to the regime, in addition to, of course, tribes that had long rejected it and families that had long rejected it. So, which indicated the existence of a popular base against the Sultan. You had all these youth that had been affected by the imamate experience, but went far to the left of the imamate, and they became committed Marxists. And then you had people like the sons of walis, governors in Oman. You had, people who were in the military. Became very concerning. And these people were trying to adopt, they were inspired by the Cuban Revolution. And they thought that they're going to create, apply the Foucault theory of revolution to Oman. I'm sure you're familiar with it, Daniel.
Yeah, it was popularized by a Marxist French philosopher, I believe, perhaps arguably to the detriment of a number of revolutionary movements around the world.
Yeah, so Regis Debray it's very much associated with him, and the idea was, you start with a focal point here on the map, like a few focal points, and then they become the revolution will spread like oil out of these focal points. It's like when you put a drop of oil on like a plate or something, and then it spreads. Like in the case of Oman, there was this idea that, look, if we start a few armed operations led by this small number of people in different strategic locations, including attacks on army barracks, attacks in the interior, and so on, then what we'll have is a broad struggle emerging. If we can sustain it long enough, then people will, upon hearing this news, they'll join the struggle in bigger numbers, and then will create a serious problem for the government across Oman. And then the British will not be able to put down two revolutions at once, the one in Dhufar and then the one in the north. So that causes huge panic in British circles. They're able initially to put down this attempt, partly because of bad planning on the part of the revolutionaries. There were some mistakes that were done. The weapons were not good enough when it came to attacking some of the military bases. The timing was not right. There was not enough cover. There were mistakes done. But the British were like, okay, maybe there were mistakes done this time, but what about the next round? The Sultan is not removing the structural factors that are leading to the radicalization of people and their adoption of Marxist ideology and other revolutionary forms of thinking. So that's a serious problem for us. We need to do something about that. When you have the son of a conservative judge subscribe to Marxism, what does that tell you? It means that our potential for legitimation locally has collapsed. So what they do is they decide that they're going to get rid of the Sultan. They try to talk to him about changing course. They give him one last shot. He doesn't want to. So at this stage, they decide they're going to do a coup. And they had a candidate that was already there, perfect candidate for this coup, which is Qaboos, the Sultan's only son. He's a good candidate. There was another candidate, which is his half-brother, Tariq, that we discussed earlier. But Tariq was too democratic for them in his initial program. He's calling for potential constitutional monarchy and so on. They're not big fans of that. Plus, they want to enshrine the principle of primogeniture and so on. So they're like, look, Qaboos is young. He has no formed ideology. We had actually influenced him in substantial ways in his years in Britain. He spent a brief amount of time in Britain. He was sent to this awful school where he was subjected to colonial cramming on the part of this former British colonial official in India. And this was in Bury St. Edmunds. He lived in his house. I don't know if you noticed this when you're reading my book, Daniel, but I kind of felt sorry for this kid almost at that stage. And then, later on, he gets this moment where he gets an opulent experience for a couple of weeks, when the British do a big tour for him of the country. And then he gets even a tour across the world. But the point is, right after this initial moment of exposure, and of course he serves in the British Army. He went to Sandhurst after his being crammed, which is of course the equivalent to West Point, I guess, for our American listeners. It's the Royal Military Academy, and it's a lot of actually the Arab conservative leaderships graduated from that school. That was the traditional trajectory amongst the monarchies. King Hussein graduated from that school, for example. A lot of different monarchs in the region and princes graduated from that military academy. So he goes there, and then he serves with a British Army unit, the Cameroonians, and he comes back, and suddenly his father essentially tells him, "You can't leave the palace compound, and I'm going to be putting tutors that will teach you theology, Islamic theology, and Arabic language, and other subjects, and you're going to be like basically isolated from everybody." So he lives a very difficult life under those conditions. And one person that he was able to see every once in a while was, of course, a British intelligence officer that we mentioned earlier, Tim Landon. And that becomes the link between the coup planners and the actual figure that was going to be put on the crown, on the throne. And that's why Tim Landon becomes one of Qaboos's closest buddies in the future, and makes so much money. Essentially, it's how many people's money gets absorbed into the bank accounts of Tim Landon. We're talking probably in the hundreds of millions of dollars.
And the coup is plotted around the Sultan's daily schedule, particularly around his afternoon nap time. But the Sultan, I guess, is not napping at the time that he normally is, and ends up mounting a bit of an armed resistance to the coup and getting shot before being sent off to exile in England.
Right. And I'll tell you something interesting, Daniel. In the first version of my book and in my doctoral dissertation, actually, I had the overall story correct, but there were some mistakes. And later I corrected them in the paperback version. And the only reason why I'm sharing this is I think our listeners will be interested in our role as historians. I mean, we try to be as meticulous as possible, but we do make mistakes, and it's important for us to acknowledge that and to correct them when we do. So in the second edition of my book, like in the first edition, I believed some of the British colonial forces, sources. The head of the army, this guy John Graham, wrote this pompous memoir called Ponder Anew, Reflections on the 20th Century. I mean, I don't know how anybody like in their right mind would write something like that. It's so grandiose and but anyways, that guy comes in and says, the Sultan tried to escape, and he begged for forgiveness, he begged for us to save his life, that kind of thing. Later on, one day, like I get this call from an Irish officer who had actually led the company that went into the palace and had the firefight with the Sultan. And I knew who he was because, of course, I know his name from the sources. It's just he had never published his account up to then. I mean, now he has, but at that stage, he hadn't revealed anything. And he comes to me and he's like, I want to talk to you, Dr. Takriti. Look, I read your book. I think it's outstanding. It's like all these British books are lying. Your book actually was telling the truth. But I want to tell you something. You have one mistake, which is you produced John Graham's account. And he was lying about the Sultan. The honest truth was the Sultan fought to the very end. And we threatened him with throwing a grenade inside and basically killing everybody. That was the only way we could stop essentially the fight. Now, why is this so important? Is that all of these accounts that were produced later were designed to legitimate the outcome that happened after. They wanted to show Qaboos as a hero and as someone with valor and honor. They wanted to show the British as having valor and honor and as being magnanimous and forgiving. They wanted to show this as a case of a local initiative led by a heroic young man, Qaboos, who saw his country heading in a bad direction and wanted to save it, kind of like a Superman or a Spider-Man or something, some heroic character. And he comes in and he leads Omani forces to carry out this coup. The honest truth was there wasn't a single Omani actually inside, aside from one token figure that they left downstairs. They didn't even take him to the main fight. So this was carried out entirely by British forces. But we end up in a situation where this version of events becomes very important for counterinsurgency in the next phase, because they want to make a distinction between father and son. For the counterinsurgency to succeed, they want to say Qaboos is a savior, Said bin Taymur, bad guy. And then Qaboos, being a savior, he's also a local savior. He's not colonially influenced, even though, of course, the whole setup is colonial. And thirdly, the Qaboos will correct the mistakes that led to the rise of these disgruntled groups, but also he will restore the dignity of Islam. And this becomes a big theme. They start pitting this and orchestrating a version of events where this is a clash between Islam and communism. And we know how this story goes because we've seen it happen in other parts of the world where they've used this kind of counterinsurgency. In Latin America, often you had this use of religion, Catholicism, other versions of theology, saying, look, we're fighting godless communists. In other parts of the world, we've seen it over and over again.
Afghanistan
It becomes a very important part of the fight. So, and of course, in this situation, it takes a while for this version of events to work, between the enormous amounts of money that were pumped in and between this ideological cover that was brought in. The situation for the revolutionaries became tough. And later on, and I guess we'll discuss this in a second, the geopolitical forces that were brought in made it enormously difficult for the revolution to succeed.
The revolution was ultimately defeated in 1975, and the critical factor is, unsurprisingly, British colonial power. And British colonial power being instrumental, you write, in helping Sultan Qaboos establish a newly absolutist state. How did the end of the war play out the way that it did? And specifically, what factors, what foreign interventions proved most consequential, and why do you emphasize this concept of the absolutist state in terms of what ultimately consolidated the Sultanate's victory?
Right. So I think it's very important. When I was writing about this situation, I was thinking very much about how you have a trivialization of politics in discussions about Dhufar. This is told as a story of Cold War story. There was this communist menace. The heroic forces came and took care of it. And the people of Oman now live a great life, and everything is great. That narrative is powerful, by the way. Continues to be dominant in the Arab region, most importantly. It's the story of the conservative regimes, that these revolutionaries brought us nothing but destruction and chaos. And the forces of order, the forces of conservatism, are the ones that have allowed for any development to take place, for any stability, for the perpetuation of ordinary life in a decent manner. So I wanted to go back to the political philosophy aspects of this, and I wanted to also think about this not just as a story under this banner of like Islam versus Marxism. I wanted to think, okay, so what was the Marxism that people were promoting? And of course, they adopted Marxism at a later stage. Earlier, it was something else. It was Pan-Arabism, but it became like a combination of the two eventually. But what was the real content? And I found that the constant demand was for popular sovereignty. They were anti-monarchist. They did not believe that rule should be concentrated in the figure of an individual, and that they did not believe that individual should enjoy absolute rule. Part of the argument in my book was to say there had not been in the history of Oman any situation where you had absolute rule until the British come in, carry out this coup, and create entire state formation project around this ruler that's geared towards concentrating power in him. They wanted to pursue an anti-democratic vision with him. And at best, somebody with a paternalistic instinct that will take his cut out of the oil money, but will at least give some, will distribute some around. So this is essentially what takes place in here. So the British create an absolutist system. And in insisting on that, I was also exploring ways of understanding the relationship between absolutism and colonialism in this region. Because when I was writing about this story, Daniel, this was the era of the war on terror. I started this project in 2005, and everybody was just talking about Islam, terrorism, and democracy not being suited for these people. Democracy has to come from the empire through invading the place and forcing it upon the people. And of course, this was the time of the Iraq War, where the Americans were pretending to be carrying out a democratic experiment there, which is the biggest falsehood that has been done in the past 20 years, one of them. So there was no democratic experiment in this region carried out by colonialism. Quite the contrary. What you had was an anchoring of absolutist rule, and Oman was a perfect case study for that. In order to anchor this rule, the British knew that their government didn't want to spend enough on the counterinsurgency, so they created this coalition of forces around them, regional forces, that could come in and contribute in major ways to suppressing the revolution. They needed to assemble a huge force. So on the one level, rebuilt the Sultan's army, expanded it substantially. So the SAF, the Sultan's armed forces, were expanded substantially. The Sultan's air force was expanded substantially. Of course, all the top ranks were British, by the way, or mercenaries brought by the British. So this is very important for people to know. Until the mid-'80s, you didn't have a Omani commander of the Sultan armed forces. But also, you had the expansion of an intelligence service, again, under a British officer, Malcolm Dennison. You had the expansion of all these facilities to facilitate the takeover of the highlands. On top of that, you had the assembly of an assemblage of forces in this region that were powerful local forces.
The Shah.
The Shah was the most important because Iran is next door. It's a huge country with massive resources, and it was benefiting at this stage from the Nixon doctrine and from the heavy American investment in the expansion of its army. So the American strategy at this stage was to depend on anchoring the American position in this part of the world through two twin pillars, Saudi Arabia and Iran. So this was very important for them. And the British wanted to access the Saudi money for this, and they wanted to access the Iranian military power for this. Now, the Saudis were a bit more hesitant. Took them a while, but eventually they came into this coalition through putting in substantial amounts of money that saved Oman from financial crises. At the same time, the Iranians came in with enormous military investment, and they sent troops. The Shah saw himself as being a kind of a bulwark against communism, and he was leading this crusade against communism in the region. Besides the Shah and the Saudi money, you also had support from Jordan. Jordan sent in engineering corps. The Jordanian army is small but efficient, and they sent in planes. So there was this investment in supporting Oman through also regional figures, conservative regional countries like Jordan. And that, of course, allowed Jordan itself to benefit from a relaxation of the diplomatic isolation that it was suffering from as a result of it carrying out Black September in Jordan. So you have all these forces coming in. It's just so overwhelming. I mean, the only serious support that the revolutionaries were receiving on the regional level was from South Yemen primarily. And then you had the Palestinian Revolution was offering support here and there, sending doctors, sending fighting equipment and so on. But that's not enough, you know. And then, of course, you had Chinese support in the early years because, you had this Maoist bent to the movement. This was the only Maoist revolution that had happened in the Arab world, I should note, which makes sense because it was very rural and the ideology suited the conditions. So you had Chinese support, but then the Chinese support dwindled after China decided that it had an oil crisis and that it needed to engage with these Gulf regimes and with the Shah. And then the Soviets do end up bringing support, but it comes in too late, as usual with the Soviets. It's like, okay, so for years, you left these guys without necessary equipment. I mean, I'll tell you something, Daniel, and I really believe, and this is my historical judgment as somebody who's researched this for many years and wrote about it extensively, the revolutionaries could have won any time before 1970 had they been provided with the necessary equipment. And the necessary equipment would have been, for example, something like SAM-7s, surface-to-air missiles.
To shoot planes and helicopters out of the sky.
Shoot planes, good Katyusha rockets. I mean, the British, by the way, had the same assessment. They were like, if the Soviets come in and they give them this stuff, we're screwed. Like, let's say they have Katyusha rockets, enough of them. These guys are good fighters. They would have been able to target the military base in Salalah, or RAF base. If you target that, you take it out, that's it. There's no resupply line. At least during the monsoon period. You can't bring anything by sea during the monsoon. It's just too tumultuous. What are they going to do? So the situation it could have been very good for the revolutionaries had you had that heavy investment from a state with that kind of capacity to give, like the Soviet Union. They eventually do give these weapons, but it's too late. It's after the Iranians have come in and the Jordanians have come in and the British have invested heavily, and so much oil money went into developing the army. So it was too little, too late.
You write about the Dhofar Revolution, quote, "In spite of its quintessential peripherality, it gave birth to the most significant internal threat to the modern Gulf state structure." To close out this discussion, what was it that made this revolutionary struggle on the margins of the peninsula so consequential for the entire regional system, and thus also really for the larger Arab imperial order, the larger global imperial order? How did various interstate rivalries and the imperialist power plays surrounding them intersect in Oman? What was at stake in this war?
I would invite our listeners to take a look at the map when they get an opportunity and look at Oman. You have the Straits of Hormuz there. Let's say there was a revolution that toppled the ruling authority in Oman, and it was led by basically a political front that was demanding the liberation of the entire region well beyond Oman. This is very serious. It's a very serious threat, and they have this front has a network, has an organization with branches all over the region. The seriousness of this cannot be overstated from a geopolitical standpoint. The Straits of Hormuz control oil shipping, which means, let's say you stop oil shipping, this revolutionary regime decides to disrupt it. The cost of energy would substantially go up internationally. It would have power over things like oil pricing, and here we're talking about a Marxist regime. It would have access to oil resources, which means that it might be able to carry out a Marxist path for development of a different kind than what had existed elsewhere. For example, a country like Iraq, even if there was a Marxist revolution there would be challenges because of the large population. But in places like this, there's a small population, big oil reserves. We don't know what could have happened there, but it would have been a very, very different map, a very different reality. That's a fact. European powers understood this. Britain in particular understood it. The United States understood it. It was coordinating with Britain at this stage. There was this curious relationship at this stage where the British were kind of asking for permission, being like, should we handle this alone, or do you want to be involved? And the Americans were like, no, you go ahead, handle it alone, and we'll support you if needed.
After the tripartite aggression, the British learned that they needed to ask permission from the newly senior partner in the imperial power relationship.
Absolutely. And, it's like, let's be honest, like the U.S. at this stage had already placed the slippers by the bed. Everything is like, everything is done. Like the British are they're just like the junior partner, really. And they've accepted that, and they were comfortable with it at this stage. But they're a junior partner that really depends on this region even more than the US does. Like, if you think that oil is so important for the US, it is. But it's even more important for the British. They're a country that came out of the Second World War pretty much bankrupt. Like, they have no money. This region played a big role investing surplus capital in British banks, in British real estate. And, you just have to go to London to see evidence of this everywhere. The Gulf investments in that country are enormous. This is not to count all the British expats that work in the Gulf, all the British officials that have worked in the Gulf. They were paid high salaries, making savings, bringing them back to Britain, buying a home there. I can't even begin to describe it. And the British knew that all of this is really essential. So this kind of situation, it was of paramount importance for Britain not to lose this. And also, of course, for the US not to lose this. A Cold War situation in which an ally of the Soviet Union were to take control over the most sensitive energy production hub in the world was not going to be a good prospect for the US or for Britain.
I want to finish this episode by returning to South Yemen, where the NLF government continued in power even as the Dhufari revolution was defeated. But there, unfortunately, the government of the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, it was beset by constant and often brutally violent sectarian fighting between what are described as left and right wings of the party. What accounts for this violent sectarianism? Is it reducible to substantive political differences, or were other factors at work? And what lessons, if any, are there that we on the left should learn from this sort of depressing situation of a Marxist revolution being successful and then, in many ways, devouring itself?
Yeah, so it's a very difficult question, Daniel, because there, of course, there are official disagreements that had existed within the NLF. And these were not resolved. There were also ideological differences, and they had to do also with geopolitical questions. Initially, of course, you had Qahtan al-Sha'bi being brought in as the first leader after independence. But he's seen by the Marxist wing of the NLF as being basically a social democrat who was not hardcore enough. So he gets removed. So that's the first kind of precedent that gets set for the removal of the head of state in that setting in post-independence period. So in 69, that gets branded as a corrective move. They're saying we had to save the pathway of the revolution from a direction where it was not heading towards socialism, it was heading somewhere else. Okay, and some people say that they exaggerated the extent to which Qahtan al-Sha'bi was right wing. There are all sorts of assessments that say, well, I mean, it's difficult to think in these terms when in a country which was so underdeveloped and where what you could do economically was kind of limited. The options were not that great to begin with. So, and using terminology that applies to other places might be too, how can I say it? Might be too reductive. At the same time, there are others that point out to the fact that, yes, there is a genuine ideological disagreement here. And, some people wanted to collectivize land. Some people wanted to carry out certain policies, and despite the limitations of carrying out these policies in an area that is so underdeveloped economically, I'm speaking, of course, and, they wanted to do that anyways. They wanted to skip stages. They were not going to wait for capitalism to emerge in South Yemen before carrying out a transformation towards socialism. So that's basically the argument. Now, after the corrective move, what you have is essentially a figure that's closer to China and to the Maoist line of thinking take power. And that's a president who is called Salim Rubai al-Ali. And he's Part of the reason, of course, why even Dhufar takes a Maoist bent is because of the influence of somebody like Salmi. His position was, we're not going to depend on the Soviets for our developmental model. China offers a better developmental model for a rural society like ours. He tried to cultivate closer relationships with the Chinese, and essentially, and which had a meaning in that period. Remember, this is the height of the Sino-Soviet split. It's either or. You don't get to like mix the two together. So that had implications for the relationship with the Soviet Union, and implications for all sorts of things. As the years go by and China changes its policy, and we know that, we spoke already about this. By 1972, the Chinese know they have an oil crisis, and they need to re-engage. And then, so by the mid-70s, they fully stopped basically supporting radical forces in this region. So you had figures that were seeking a reorientation. And some of these figures were anyways convinced of the need to reorient to begin with. They were cultivating closer relationships with the Soviet Union, and they were advocating a more Soviet-style type of development program. And they were also advocating a more Soviet-style form of rule. And in particular, the main ideologue behind that was a guy called Abdel Fattah Ismail. So you have a clash emerging between Abdel Fattah Ismail and Salmin over this point. And part of this clash has to do with the idea of forming what Abdel Fattah Ismail was advocating for, which is a Yemeni Socialist Party. And it would become kind of the state party along Soviet lines. That was, he had these ideas for that. This was not the vision that Salmin was advocating politically. Again, he was not fully convinced of that model. He loses essentially. He gets executed. So this form of this situation then leads to another set of conflicts between those that were advocating a more hardcore Soviet line and those who were a hardcore Soviet line that still clashes with regional powers. So Fattah Ismail was, yes, advocating closer cooperation with the Soviet Union, but he's not advocating lowering the temperature with Saudi Arabia, for example. So he has a clash with another wing that's not so as committed to Marxism, and that is more pragmatic on regional alignments. And that wing is represented by Ali Nasser Muhammad. So there is a situation where the two clash. Eventually, Ali Nasser Muhammad comes in, and Ali Nasser Muhammad, institutes in the early 80s a shift towards, lowering the temperature with Saudi Arabia, some Marxism, but not too hardcore. And at the same time, there is a defense treaty with the Soviet Union, which is the first of its kind in that regional setting. So all of this is substantive. It has to do with geopolitical and economic decisions at home that are not insubstantial. But at the same time, and this is coming from quarters that were close to the Yemeni revolution, and I've met a lot of people that were close to it or were in the circles of power around it. They felt that underneath the substantive elements, there were also regional and tribal competitions happening between different factions that supported these different figures. I would not reduce everything to that, but it did play a role. Because whenever you had an explosion of major conflict between these figures, sometimes over political and substantive issues, the fact of the matter is that forces that get activated behind them tended to come from their regions or tended to come from their tribal confederations, which meant that even if they did have a substantial difference, when it came to fighting amongst each other, they had to rely on earlier kinship or regional networks. And they had to activate them. That was something that caused enormous loss in Yemen. After Ali Nasser Muhammad, he rules up till 86, but then he goes through a crisis himself, and you have forces that try to basically take him out under Ali Nasser al-Bid. That conflict ends up with thousands of deaths. Thousands. I mean, entire houses are shelled. There's artillery being used. There's like neighborhoods are taken out. Like it went really nasty. So I think it's a combination of both factors. I should note I'm lucky to be advising a wonderful PhD student who's going to be writing about these dynamics and who is writing about these dynamics, Fadi Qafaiti. There is going to be an emerging scholarship on this, and in Arabic there's a lot that is emerging about that period, and we're getting more and more information about this wonderful and an incredible country that had undergone one of the most important revolutionary experiences in modern Arab history, and which, of course, now is suffering from a very big set of challenges. One final note, Daniel, throughout this, another factor that we did not fully address, but that maybe listeners could choose to explore on the side, is the relationship between North and South Yemen, because both countries were advocating unity at this stage, and some of the South Yemeni leaderships actually came from the North. So there was always this relationship that had existed, and vice versa. So there was a commitment to unification in theory, although in practice it was always much more difficult. And we know that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, South Yemen went through a serious crisis, no longer had the money to be able to sustain itself, and it no longer had the military backing that it needed. So eventually it needed to unify with the North, but under conditions that were disadvantageous to it. And to this day, that issue of unity and unity under which terms has not been fully determined. And it's caused a civil war in the early 90s. And now it's causing a long-term set of civil wars that are also regionally backed by different actors that do not necessarily want the best for the Yemeni people. And that's taken place because of the unresolved visions for the two spaces.
Looking back across, I guess, 3 decades of efforts at revolution and reform across the Arabian Peninsula, succeeding at times, but often failing, at least in terms of accomplishing the ultimate objectives. What's your overall assessment?
So the overall assessment, I would say, is that there were some opportunities for revolutionary transformation in the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf. At the end of the day, there were only 2 major armed struggles taking place. The one in Yemen, of course, north and south, and the one in Oman. So it's only the southern part of the peninsula that really witnesses a full-on armed revolutionary struggle. But that does not mean that there were not other forms of struggle taking place, and we've tried to account for some of those. There were major labor strikes across the region, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, in Qatar. You had all sorts of mobilizations in the what is now the Emirates. You had a very interesting history taking place, but it was at a time when the local state structures had not yet been fully built, and at a time when the local rulers had not yet had the full access to the range of tools of both suppression and co-optation that they had access to later on. So, when it comes to Saudi state, it was able to accumulate enormous resources, but also a set of relationships with important imperial powers, and later on, of course, initially Britain and then the United States. That meant that it had the backing of a stabilizing force in international affairs that could also supply it with the necessary tools for local suppression. So they had the money to suppress, and they also had the weapons to do that. And really, This is a big part of this. But also, they had access to a set of legitimation mechanisms that took different forms at different stages, but that were ultimately successful in anchoring these regimes. That does not mean, by the way, I'm not suggesting that they will stay forever, but it's important for people who are interested in radical histories of this region to understand that it is very difficult to overthrow regimes that have those set of tools. Now, we've had instances where that has happened. In Iran, the Shah was backed by the United States, and the Shah had access to even bigger military arsenal. Yet, you had a very successful and huge social revolution. Probably the greatest social revolution of the second half of the 20th century happened there. It was massive. So I'm not saying it's impossible. The demographics there were different. The size of the population was different. Saudi Arabia is the only state with a very large population there amongst the Gulf states. And of course, Yemen, which has a different set of economic capacities and different politics entirely, it has a large population as well, but they're under a different kind of set of circumstances. Smaller Gulf states had protection from external threats and internal threats directly by the imperial powers. And we saw this in the case of Dhufar, for example. You have an armed struggle taking place locally. You have also an armed struggle taking place in the north, in the Jabal al-Akhdar. These are armed struggles that are backed by large social forces in this country, and in these provinces. And yet, at the moments that mattered, the British were there. Actually, they were there throughout. And they invested heavily in suppressing these forces. And they had the capacity to do that. It's a very powerful state in relative terms. And it could draw, when it was not able to do it alone, it could draw on a broader network of powerful states to come in and save the day for imperialist interests and for the local regimes. This was very significant. Now, they also were protecting these states from external threats. And we saw this especially in the case of Kuwait and later on Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. We'll talk about it later. But that was an example of nobody's allowed to take down a small Gulf state if it's a large oil producing state. What will happen is you'll have an immediate activation of a global imperial alliance with all the forces around it, and they will and intervene. So these principles get enshrined during this period. And they're designed to ensure that every ruler stays in their place, not as an individual, but as a dynasty. And of course, this is where the colonial coups angle comes in. If the individual proves not to be good for the future of the empire and the future of the local space from the standpoint of counterinsurgency and from the standpoint of preserving the system's integrity and functioning, then they can be removed. But the overall interest is to stabilize as much as possible and to make sure that the regional map stays the same.
That was the 13th episode of Thawra, the Digs series on 20th century Arab politics with Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University. A scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements, he's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website, an incredible resource that'll be back online soon. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that revolutions are the locomotives of history, while other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theoria Francos, and Ben Mabee. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also now Instagram at thedigradio. And please do find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. And if it's on iTunes or Spotify, also rate and review us. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. What really does that, though, is you telling people to check out the pod. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and going strong. Even a few bucks is huge.